You don't get to stay, she whispered, her hand trembling on the doorknob. Not tonight. The hallway light flickered above him, casting a pale glow over Daniel Hayes's rain-soaked coat, droplets sliding from his shoulders onto the worn carpet of the apartment corridor, and for a moment he didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if the storm outside had followed him all the way to her door and was now waiting for his decision. Inside, the faint cry of a baby broke through the silence, thin and desperate, echoing through the small space behind Emily Carter, and she flinched at the sound like it was a reminder she couldn't escape, her free hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as if it were the only thing holding her upright after a day that had stretched far beyond what any one person should carry. The apartment smelled faintly of formula and damp laundry, the kind of scent that clung to places where life was lived $1 at a time, where every bill mattered and every night felt like a quiet negotiation with exhaustion. Daniel's eyes moved past her shoulder for just a second, catching the dim light of a single lamp inside, the outline of a crib tucked into the corner, a pile of unopened envelopes stacked neatly on a small table, and something in his expression shifted, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition, as if he had just stepped into a reality he couldn't ignore anymore. You should go, Emily said again, this time firmer though her voice cracked at the edges, betraying the strength she was trying so hard to hold together, and she didn't meet his eyes because she knew if she did, she might hesitate, and hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had learned that the hard way, learned it through sleepless nights and empty bank accounts and the quiet humiliation of choosing between rent and formula, learned it every time someone promised help and disappeared before morning. Daniel finally exhaled, slow and steady, like he was grounding himself in something deeper than the moment, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm for the chaos pressing in around them. Not tonight. The words didn't rise, didn't demand, they simply settled into the space between them, steady and unshakable, and for the first time since he arrived, Emily looked up, really looked at him, at the man who didn't belong in hallways like this, whose polished shoes were now soaked through, whose tailored coat had lost its sharp lines under the weight of rain, whose presence felt out of place, and yet somehow exactly where it needed to be. You don't understand, she said, shaking her head, stepping back just enough to create distance but not enough to close the door. This isn't your world. Behind her, the baby's cry grew louder, sharper now, cutting through whatever control she had left, and she turned instinctively, torn between pushing him away and running back inside, her shoulders tightening with the kind of pressure that came from being the only one responsible, the only one who couldn't fall apart. Daniel didn't argue, didn't step forward, didn't try to force his way in, he just stood there, rain dripping from his sleeve, watching her with a quiet focus that made everything else fade, and then, without another word, he reached up and gently pushed the door wider, not enough to invade, just enough to close the gap she had left open, and Emily froze, caught between resistance and relief, between the instinct to protect herself and the undeniable pull of someone who refused to walk away. The storm outside rattled the windows, the hallway light buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the distance a car horn echoed through the night, but inside that small apartment doorway, everything narrowed to a single moment, a single choice, and as the baby cried again, louder this time, Daniel stepped just inside the threshold, his voice low, steady, and impossible to ignore. Let me help. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second that felt longer than it should have, her breath catching in her throat as the baby's cry sharpened into something more urgent, more desperate. An instinct overrode everything else as she turned fully toward the small crib in the corner, leaving the door open behind her without realizing it, and Daniel followed only as far as the edge of the worn rug, stopping there, as if he understood that crossing too far, too fast would break something fragile that had not yet decided whether to trust him. The apartment was smaller than it had looked from the hallway, barely 600 square feet, the walls lined with mismatched furniture that told a story of survival rather than choice, a faded couch pushed against one wall, a narrow kitchen visible just beyond, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator filling the quiet spaces between the baby's cries. Emily scooped up the infant with practiced urgency, holding her close against her chest, whispering soft reassurances that trembled under the weight of exhaustion, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek as if memorizing every detail while trying to calm her at the same time. "It is okay, sweetheart, I am here," she murmured, pacing a small path between the crib and the couch, her movements automatic, almost mechanical, as though her body knew what to do even when her mind was too tired to keep up. Daniel watched in silence, his gaze steady but gentle, taking in the way she shifted her weight to support the baby, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly when she thought no one was paying attention, the way the room itself seemed to press in around her like a constant reminder of everything she was carrying alone. "How long has she been crying like that?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough not to startle her, and Emily did not answer right away, as if the question itself required energy she did not have, until finally she exhaled and said, "On and off all day, maybe longer." Her eyes fixed on the baby rather than him. "She has been fussy for a week now. I think it is the formula, but the doctor says to give it time." And there was a pause, a small one, before she added under her breath, "Everything costs time." Daniel nodded slightly, though she was not looking at him, and he took a slow step toward the kitchen counter where a bottle sat half prepared, the water line just below where it should be, the powder not fully mixed, and without asking, he picked it up and adjusted it carefully, measuring by instinct more than knowledge, then shook it gently until the liquid turned smooth and even, his movements deliberate, controlled, as though he approached this simple task with the same focus he gave to decisions worth millions of dollars. Emily noticed, of course she did, her eyes flickering toward him with a mixture of confusion and something else she could not quite name, because men like him did not stand in small kitchens fixing baby bottles, they did not notice details like uneven measurements or worn countertops, they did not belong here. And yet he was, moving quietly, not asking permission, not offering explanations, just helping. "You do not have to do that," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge, and Daniel glanced at her, then at the baby, and replied simply, "I know," before stepping closer and holding the bottle out to her, not pushing, just offering, and for a moment she hesitated again, caught between habit and something unfamiliar, before finally taking it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second, a small contact that lingered longer than it should have. The baby latched onto the bottle almost immediately, her cries softening into quiet whimpers, then into steady breathing, and the shift in the room was almost physical, like a pressure valve releasing, and Emily closed her eyes for a second, just 1 second, as relief washed over her in a way she had not expected, her shoulders dropping, her grip loosening just enough to show how tightly she had been holding everything together. Daniel stepped back again, giving her space, but he did not leave, not even when the silence settled in, not even when the storm outside softened to a distant patter against the windows, and Emily noticed that too, the way he stayed without demanding anything, without filling the quiet with unnecessary words, and it unsettled her more than if he had argued, because staying required something deeper than speaking, something she had not seen in a long time. "Why are you really here?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, almost fragile, as she looked down at her daughter rather than at him, and Daniel did not answer right away, his gaze resting on the two of them as if he was measuring something invisible, something that could not be calculated or controlled, before he said, slowly and honestly, "Because I should have come sooner." Emily's breath caught at his words, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were simple, and somehow that made them harder to dismiss, harder to push away like everything else she had learned not to rely on, and she shook her head slightly as if trying to clear the weight of them from her thoughts, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of her daughter drinking from the bottle, the small, fragile sound grounding her in something real. Something she could control, sooner for. "What?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a guarded edge that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with survival, because questions like that came with expectations, and expectations had a way of turning into disappointments. Daniel did not move closer this time, did not try to close the distance she had carefully maintained, he simply leaned his hand lightly against the back of a chair, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he understood that the space between them was not measured in feet but in trust, and that trust was not something he could rush. For that day, he said, his gaze steady but not forceful. At the office, and Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the bottle, a subtle shift that spoke louder than any words, because she remembered, of course she remembered, the way the room had felt too cold, too quiet, the way every pair of eyes had seemed to judge without understanding, the way she had stood there trying to explain why she had been late. Again, why she needed the job, why she could not afford to lose it, and the way no one had stepped in, no one had said anything, not even him. "You were there," she said, not a question, just a statement that carried a quiet accusation beneath it, and Daniel nodded once, accepting it without defense. "I was," he replied, and there was no excuse in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth, just a simple acknowledgement that settled heavily between them. Emily let out a small, tired laugh that held no humor, her eyes still on her daughter as she spoke. "And you watched." And the words were not sharp, not angry, just resigned, as if she had already made peace with the idea that people with power chose when to care and when to look away. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm when he answered, "I did." And then, after a brief pause that felt deliberate, "And I was wrong." And that, more than anything else, made Emily look up, really look at him again, because apologies like that did not come easily from men like him, not in rooms like this, not without conditions attached. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, the bottle nearly empty now, and Emily adjusted her hold, her movements slower than before, as if the exhaustion she had been holding back was beginning to surface, her shoulders dipping just a fraction, her guard lowering without her permission. "Why does it matter now?" she asked, her voice softer, less defensive, but still careful, because she needed to understand the reason behind his presence, needed something that made sense in a world that rarely did. Daniel took a breath, his gaze briefly drifting to the small stack of unopened bills on the table, then back to her, and when he spoke again, his words carried a quiet weight that felt different from before, more personal, less controlled. "Because I recognized something I should not have ignored," he said. "And by the time I realized it, you were already gone." And there was a pause, not empty but full, as if he was choosing what to say next with care. "I had people try to find you," he added, not as a boast, but as a confession. "But you do not make it easy to be found." And for the first time, a faint, almost reluctant hint of warmth touched his expression, softening the sharp edges of who he was supposed to be. Emily shook her head again, though this time it was slower, less certain. "That is the point," she said quietly. "When you are used to things falling apart, you learn not to stay in one place too long." And the honesty in her voice lingered in the room like something fragile, something that could break if handled too roughly. Daniel did not interrupt, did not offer a solution or a promise, he simply listened, his presence steady, grounded, and that, more than anything, unsettled her in a way she could not explain, because it was easier to push away someone who argued, someone who insisted, but it was harder to dismiss someone who stayed silent and still refused to leave. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle rhythm against the windows, the storm losing its intensity, and inside, the small apartment felt different now, not larger, not brighter, but quieter in a way that made space for something new, something uncertain. And as Emily looked down at her daughter, now calm and drifting toward sleep, she realized that for the first time that night, she was not completely alone, and she did not know what to do with that. The quiet did not last long, not in a place like this, not in a life like hers, because just as Emily lowered her daughter gently into the crib, easing the small blanket around her with careful hands, a sharp knock cut through the calm, loud enough to make her shoulders tense instantly, her entire body reacting before her mind could catch up, and she froze for a second, staring at the door as if it might disappear if she ignored it. But the knock came again, firmer this time, followed by a voice from the hallway, impatient and unmistakable. "Miss Carter, I know you are in there." And Emily closed her eyes briefly, a quiet exhale slipping past her lips as the fragile sense of relief she had just found began to unravel. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the door, his posture straightening slightly, not alarmed, not aggressive, just attentive, as if he was already assessing a situation he did not yet fully understand, while Emily moved slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the entrance. Each step measured like she was walking into something she had been trying to avoid all day. She stopped just short of the door, her hand hovering near the handle, and for a moment she did not open it, as if delaying it might somehow change what waited on the other side, but the voice came again, sharper now. "We need to talk about your rent." And there it was, the reality she had been holding back, pressing in without mercy. Emily opened the door just enough to see the man standing there, her landlord, his expression tight with irritation, his arms crossed as if he had already decided how this conversation would end, and she stepped into the doorway, blocking his view of the apartment behind her as much as she could, her voice steady but low. "It is late," she said, though she knew that would not matter, not to him, not to anyone who had the power to decide whether she and her child had a place to sleep. "That is exactly why I am here," he replied, his tone clipped. "You are already 2 weeks behind, and I cannot keep waiting." And Emily swallowed, the words landing heavier than they should have, because they were not new, because she had heard them before, but tonight they felt different, sharper, closer to something final. Behind her, Daniel remained where he was, not interrupting, not stepping forward, but listening, his presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension building at the door. "I told you I would have it by Friday," Emily said, her voice tightening just slightly, the strain of holding everything together beginning to show. "I just need a little more time." And the landlord shook his head, already dismissing her words before she could finish. "Time is not something I can keep giving you," he said. "I have responsibilities too." And Emily nodded faintly, because she understood it too well. The difference was that her responsibilities had nowhere else to go. The hallway light flickered again, casting uneven shadows across the narrow space, and for a moment everything felt smaller, more confined, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and Emily felt it, that familiar pressure rising in her chest, the one that came when options ran out and there was nothing left but endurance. "Please," she said, the word quiet but honest, not dramatic, not pleading in a way that demanded sympathy, just real, just tired. "Just a few more days." And there was a pause, a brief one, where it seemed like the man might consider it, might hesitate, but then his expression hardened again, and he began to respond, his voice firm, final, ready to close the conversation. That was when Daniel moved, not quickly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that shifted the balance of the moment. Without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he stepped forward just enough to be seen, his presence filling the doorway in a way that did not need explanation, and the landlord's words stopped mid-sentence, his eyes flicking toward Daniel, confusion crossing his face first, then something else, something closer to recognition. Daniel did not introduce himself, did not offer justification. He simply looked at the man with calm, measured focus and said, "How much is she behind?" And the question landed differently than Emily's plea, not softer, not kinder, just direct in a way that demanded an answer, and the landlord hesitated, caught off guard by the shift in control, before replying. 2 weeks. His tone less certain now. "Plus late fees?" And Daniel nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already decided, and for a moment he said nothing else, the silence stretching just long enough to change the air between them. Emily turned slightly, her eyes searching his face, confusion and disbelief mixing with something she did not want to name, because she had not asked for this, had not wanted him to step in like this, and yet he had, without hesitation, without permission, and it unsettled her more than the problem itself. Daniel reached into his coat, pulling out his wallet with the same steady composure he had shown all night, and he did not rush. Did not make a show of it, he simply said, "That will not be a problem. Tonight." And in that moment, everything shifted again, not because of the money, not because of the solution, but because for the first time, someone had stepped into her reality and refused to let it collapse around her, and Emily stood there, caught between resistance and relief, realizing that this night was not going the way she had planned, and she did not know if that was something to fear or something to hold on to. Emily's reaction came a second too late. her breath catching as she reached out instinctively, her voice sharper than before. "No, you cannot do that!" And it was not anger that filled her tone, it was something deeper, something rooted in pride and fear and the quiet refusal to owe anyone anything she could not repay, because she had learned what that kind of help usually cost, even when no one said it out loud. Daniel did not look at her immediately, his attention still on the landlord, his expression composed, unreadable, as he finished what he had started without raising his voice, without making the moment larger than it already was. And the man standing in the hallway shifted his weight awkwardly, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a cautious hesitation, as he accepted what was being offered without fully understanding why. "This covers the balance and the fees," Daniel said simply, his tone steady, and the landlord nodded quickly, almost too quickly, his posture changing in a way that spoke louder than words, his shoulders relaxing, his stance less rigid, as if the entire situation had just rewritten itself in front of him. "Yes, of course, that should be fine," he replied, his voice softer now, more agreeable, and he glanced once more between the two of them, trying to place Daniel, trying to reconcile the man standing in this dim hallway with whatever recognition was forming in his mind, but Daniel did not offer clarity, did not confirm or deny, he simply gave a slight nod, signaling the end of the conversation in a way that left no room for negotiation. The landlord cleared his throat, stepping back slightly, his earlier impatience replaced with something closer to politeness. "I will update the account first thing in the morning," he said, almost as if he needed to justify his presence now, and Emily stood there, silent, her hands clenched at her sides, watching the exchange unfold like it did not belong to her life, like she had somehow stepped into someone else's story for just a moment. "Thank you," the landlord added, directing it toward Daniel before turning to leave, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hallway until the sound disappeared entirely, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than before. Emily closed the door slowly, her hand lingering on the handle for a second longer than necessary, as if she needed that extra moment to steady herself, and when she turned back around, her eyes found Daniel. Immediately, her expression no longer guarded in the same way, but not softened either, something more complicated settling in its place. "I told you to go," she said, her voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before, because this was different. This was not just someone staying, this was someone stepping into her life in a way she had not allowed in a long time, and she was not sure how to respond to that. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been from the moment he refused to leave, and for a second he said nothing, letting the weight of her words exist without interruption, before answering quietly, "I heard you." And there was no defiance in his tone, no challenge, just a simple truth that made it harder for her to push back. Emily shook her head slightly, a small, almost disbelieving motion, her arms crossing loosely in front of her as if she needed something to hold on to. "That was not your responsibility," she said, and this time her voice wavered just a little, the exhaustion from earlier creeping back in, blending with something more fragile beneath it. "You cannot just come in here and fix things like that." And Daniel's expression shifted just enough to show that he understood what she was really saying, that it was not about the money, not really, it was about control, about independence, about the fragile balance she had built to survive. "I did not come here to fix everything," he replied, his voice calm but firm, his eyes steady on hers. "I came here because you should not have to carry all of it alone." And the words landed differently than she expected, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, like a truth she had not allowed herself to consider. Emily looked away first, her gaze drifting toward the crib where her daughter now slept peacefully, unaware of the shift that had just taken place, unaware of how close everything had been to unraveling. And for a moment Emily said nothing, her thoughts moving faster than she could sort through them, because part of her wanted to argue, to push him out, to reclaim the space she had fought so hard to maintain, and another part, quieter but persistent, recognized something she had been missing, something she had not realized she needed until now. "You cannot stay," she said finally, though the words did not carry the same certainty they had before, and Daniel did not respond right away. his gaze following hers to the crib, then back to her, and when he spoke, it was softer than before, but no less steady. "I am not asking to stay forever," he said. "Just tonight." And there it was again, that same quiet insistence, not forceful, not overwhelming, just present in a way that made it difficult to ignore, and Emily stood there, caught between everything she had learned and everything she was beginning to feel, realizing that the hardest part was not letting him in, it was deciding whether she could trust that he would not leave. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences before it, not heavy with conflict, not sharp with uncertainty, but suspended, as if the entire room had paused to understand what would happen next, and Emily remained still by the crib, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the wooden frame, her eyes fixed on her sleeping daughter as if grounding herself in something that could not argue back. While Daniel stood a few feet away, close enough to be present but distant enough to respect the invisible boundaries she was still drawing, the apartment's dim light softened everything, turning the edges of worn furniture and tired walls into something almost gentle, and for the first time that night, Emily noticed how quiet it really was without the storm pressing against the windows, without the voices from the hallway, without the constant noise of survival pushing her forward. "You do not have to do this," she said again, though her voice lacked the earlier sharpness, replaced instead by something more uncertain, more honest, and she finally turned to face him fully, her expression tired but searching, as if she was trying to find the moment where this had shifted from intrusion to presence. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation, his posture unchanged, calm in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in a space like this, and he replied, "I know." Simply, as if that answer contained everything he needed to say, and then added after a brief pause, "But I am not leaving you alone tonight." And the words were not dramatic, not forceful, just steady, like a decision already made. Emily exhaled slowly, her arms loosening at her sides as she looked away for a moment, conflicted, because part of her wanted to refuse again, to hold on to the independence she had fought for through every difficult night, but another part of her, quieter and more exhausted, understood that she did not have the strength to argue with the reality of her situation anymore. She moved toward the small kitchen without speaking, her steps slow, deliberate, as she reached for a glass and filled it with water, her movements automatic as if giving herself something to do would keep her thoughts from spiraling, and Daniel watched but did not interfere, did not offer help this time. Simply remained where he was, respecting the space she had not explicitly given but also not taken away. "You said you should have come sooner," Emily said suddenly, her back still turned to him, her voice softer now, almost careful, and Daniel's eyes shifted toward her immediately, his attention fully present again. "Why?" she asked, and the question hung in the air longer than she intended, because it was not just about timing, it was about meaning, about what had changed, about why someone like him would step into a life like hers at all. Daniel took a slow breath before answering, his voice quieter now, less controlled. "Because I saw you that day and did nothing," he said, and there was a pause that carried weight without needing explanation. "And I told myself it was not my place," he continued, his gaze steady. "But I have learned that sometimes people say that when they are afraid to get involved." And Emily turned slightly at that, her expression softening in a way she did not immediately recognize, because the honesty in his words did not feel rehearsed or strategic. It felt uncomfortable, like something he was still trying to understand himself. The baby stirred in the crib again, a small sound breaking through the quiet, and Emily moved instinctively toward her, adjusting the blanket gently, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge as she checked her daughter's breathing, and Daniel's gaze followed her, not intruding, not analyzing, just observing with a kind of attention that felt different from anything she was used to receiving. "I do not need saving," Emily said after a moment, though her voice was no longer defensive, just tired, and Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. "I am not here to save you," he replied. "I am here because I understand what it feels like when no one shows up." And that sentence lingered in the space between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, just true in a way that could not be easily dismissed. Emily sat down slowly on the edge of the small couch, her shoulders finally dropping as the exhaustion she had been holding back began to settle in her body, and for the first time she did not immediately try to stand back up, did not immediately prepare for the next problem. She simply sat, watching her daughter, listening to the quiet rhythm of the room, and Daniel remained standing where he was, not closer, not further, simply present. Outside, the rain had almost completely faded, leaving only occasional drops against the window, and inside, the apartment no longer felt like a place collapsing under pressure, but like a space holding two people who were still learning what it meant to stay in the same moment without running from it. And Emily did not say yes, she did not say no, she only let the silence remain without pushing it away, and for now, that was enough. The night deepened slowly, not with sudden change but with a gentle fading of sound, as if the world outside the small apartment had decided to lower its voice out of respect for what was unfolding inside, and Emily remained seated on the edge of the couch, her hands loosely folded in her lap, watching her daughter sleep with a kind of exhaustion that had softened into something quieter, something almost unfamiliar. While Daniel stayed near the kitchen counter, no longer intrusive, no longer uncertain, simply present in a way that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. The light above them flickered once, then steadied, casting a warm glow that made the room feel less harsh than it had earlier, and for the first time in a long time, Emily did not feel like she was bracing for the next problem. She only felt the weight of stillness, and that stillness felt strange. "You should be tired," she said after a long pause, her voice low, almost conversational now, as if she was testing whether normal speech still existed in a night like this, and Daniel glanced toward her, a faint shift in expression suggesting he had not even considered it. "I am," he replied simply, and there was something almost grounding in the honesty of it, something that made him feel less distant, less like an interruption in her life and more like a person occupying the same fragile space. Emily nodded slightly, looking down at her hands. "People like you usually do not stay in places like this," she said without accusation, just observation, and Daniel's gaze followed her for a moment before he answered, "People like me usually do not see places like this." And the sentence lingered between them, not heavy, but revealing in a way neither of them immediately addressed. The baby shifted softly in the crib, a small sound that pulled Emily's attention instantly, and she rose without hesitation, moving to check on her daughter, adjusting the blanket with a tenderness that seemed instinctive, and Daniel watched quietly, noticing how every movement she made carried both care and fatigue, as if she had learned to perform love while running on empty. "She calms down when you hold her like that," he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful rather than instructive, and Emily paused briefly, then responded without looking back. "She calms down when she feels safe." And there was no bitterness in her words, only truth shaped by experience. Daniel leaned slightly against the counter, crossing his arms loosely, his presence steady, and for a while either of them spoke, allowing the silence to settle again. But this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, just shared. Then his phone vibrated softly in his pocket, breaking the rhythm of the moment, and he hesitated before pulling it out, glancing at the screen briefly, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes, and Emily noticed the change in his expression, subtle but real. Though she did not ask, she simply waited as he turned the phone face down without answering. "You do not have to ignore that," she said quietly, and Daniel looked back at her. "It can wait," he replied, and the simplicity of it surprised her more than the act itself, because men like him, men with responsibilities she could only imagine, did not usually set things aside without consequence. Emily shifted slightly on the couch, pulling her knees closer, her gaze drifting toward him again. "I still do not know why you are really here," she said, softer now, less defensive than before, and Daniel's expression changed again, not guarded, not distant, but thoughtful, as if he was searching for the most honest version of an answer he had not fully shaped yet. "Because I think I forgot what it means to just be in a room without trying to control it," he said finally, and Emily blinked slightly at that, not expecting the answer to sound like that, not expecting it to sound like a confession rather than a statement of intent. Outside, the last traces of rain faded completely, leaving only the faint hum of distant traffic, and inside, the apartment felt different again, not transformed, not fixed, but softened, as if the edges of the night had been gently smoothed. Emily looked toward her daughter, then back at Daniel, and for the first time she did not ask him to leave, but she also did not ask him to stay. She only allowed the moment to exist without forcing it into a decision, and Daniel, sensing that, did the same, remaining where he was, not as a savior, not as a guest, but simply as someone who had chosen not to walk away when it would have been easier to do so. Morning arrived quietly, without urgency, as if the night had decided to release its hold on the apartment slowly rather than all at once, and Emily woke on the couch still fully clothed, her body stiff from sleep but her mind unusually calm for the first time in a long while. The faint light of early day filtered through the thin curtains, softening the edges of everything inside the room, and for a brief moment she did not remember the weight of the previous night, only the strange sense that something had shifted without breaking. From the kitchen, she heard the low sound of movement, and when she sat up, she saw Daniel already awake, standing near the counter with a paper cup of water in his hand, looking out the small window as if he was studying a world that was far simpler here than the one he usually occupied. The baby was still asleep, peaceful in the crib, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that brought a quiet relief to the room, and Emily watched her for a moment before speaking, her voice still heavy with sleep. "You did not leave," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Daniel turned slightly, acknowledging her with a calm expression. "I said I would not," he replied, as if that explained everything, and maybe in that moment it did. Emily sat up fully, pulling her legs beneath her arms resting loosely around herself as she took in the scene more clearly, noticing small details she had not processed before, the way he had folded a blanket that had fallen on the floor, the way the kitchen counter was slightly more organized than it had been the night before, not transformed, just cared for, and it unsettled her in a quiet way, because she was not used to people leaving things better than they found them. "I do not usually let people stay," she said after a pause, her tone honest rather than defensive, and Daniel nodded once. "I figured," he replied simply, and there was no judgment in it, only understanding. The silence between them this time was different from before, less uncertain, more natural, and Emily found herself standing, moving toward the crib again, adjusting the small blanket even though it did not need adjusting, just needing something to do with her hands while her thoughts tried to catch up with everything she was feeling. "You did not answer your phone last night," she said suddenly, remembering the brief vibration she had noticed earlier, and Daniel glanced toward the counter where his phone lay, still untouched. "It can wait," he repeated, and then added after a short pause, "Most things can wait longer than people think." And Emily looked at him then, really looked, noticing something different in his expression compared to the night before, less guarded, less distant, as if the quiet had taken something sharp out of him. A soft sound came from the crib, and the baby stirred awake, her small eyes blinking open slowly, and Emily moved immediately, lifting her with practiced care, holding her close as she began to wake fully, and Daniel watched again, not intruding, not stepping in, just observing with a kind of attention that felt steady rather than invasive. "She is calmer today," he said, and Emily nodded faintly. "She sleeps better when she is not stressed," she replied, though the words carried more meaning than just the child, and for a moment neither of them added anything else. A notification lit up Daniel's phone again, this time longer, persistent, and Emily noticed it too, but said nothing, only watching as he finally picked it up, reading the screen with a quiet shift in expression that suggested responsibility waiting beyond this room, beyond this moment. He turned it off without replying again, and that small action landed differently in the morning light, because it was no longer about staying for convenience, it was about choosing to remain present when he did not have to. Emily held her daughter a little closer, her gaze lowering for a moment as she spoke softly, almost to herself. "People do not usually stay when things get complicated." And Daniel answered without hesitation, "Then most people leave too early." And the simplicity of it made her pause. The room felt smaller in daylight, but not in a suffocating way, more in a way that made everything visible, the worn furniture, the small signs of struggle, the quiet resilience built into every corner, and yet it no longer felt like a place collapsing inward, it felt like a place being seen. Emily finally exhaled, long and slow, her shoulders lowering as she looked at her daughter, then back at Daniel, and for the first time she did not ask him what he was doing there, because she already understood the only answer he was willing to give, and for now, that was enough. By midday, the apartment felt different again, not because anything outside had changed, but because time itself seemed to move more gently within those walls, as if the space had adjusted to the presence of two people instead of one, and Emily stood by the small kitchen sink washing a single cup that had already been cleaned twice, her movements slow and thoughtful, not out of necessity but out of habit, while Daniel sat near the table with his phone now placed face down in front of him. Untouched, as if he had decided that whatever waited on the other side of the screen could continue without him for a little longer, the baby slept again, this time more deeply, her small body wrapped in a soft blanket Emily had not even remembered owning until last night, and the sight of her like that made something in Emily's chest loosen just slightly, not fully, but enough to notice. "You do not have to keep doing that," she said without turning around, referring to the way Daniel had quietly organized the small living space earlier, stacking papers, adjusting items that had been out of place, and he responded from where he sat, his voice calm. "I am not doing it for you." And that made her pause, the water still running in her hands, before she finally turned to look at him, unsure how to interpret the words. "Then why?" she asked, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting briefly toward the crib before returning to her. "Because I notice things," he said, and after a short pause added, "and because I used to ignore them." And there was no dramatic tone in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of something he had carried for a long time. Emily turned off the water and dried her hands slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly not in suspicion but in thought, because people like him did not usually speak that way, did not usually admit things that did not benefit them, and yet everything about his presence here contradicted what she thought she knew about men in his position. "You keep saying that," she said, walking toward the table now, stopping a few feet away. "That you should have come sooner, that you noticed something." And she crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, but as if grounding herself. "But you never actually say what changed." And Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering, his expression steady but quieter than before. "What changed is that I stopped pretending I do not see things I do not have time for." And Emily let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief, just release. The baby stirred again, and both of them instinctively turned toward the crib. But Emily moved first, adjusting the blanket gently, her hand resting there for a moment longer than necessary, and Daniel watched her with the same calm attention he had shown since the night before, not invasive, not evaluating, just present. "You are not from this kind of place," Emily said after a while, not as an accusation but as a fact she could not ignore, and Daniel nodded slightly. "No," he said simply. "I am not." And there was a pause before he added, "But I know what it feels like to be surrounded by people and still be alone." And that sentence hung in the air longer than anything else had that morning. Emily looked down at her hands again, her expression softening in a way she did not fully realize, because there was something in his tone that did not sound rehearsed or strategic, it sounded remembered, and that made it harder to dismiss. Outside, the light had shifted into a pale afternoon glow, casting softer shadows across the room. And Emily finally sat down across from him, not close, not far, just within the same space without tension, and for a few moments neither of them spoke, allowing the quiet to exist without filling it. "Last night," she said eventually, her voice lower now, "you said you do not stay in places like this." And Daniel nodded once. "I usually do not," he replied, and then after a brief pause added, "But I stayed anyway." And Emily studied him carefully, searching for the reason behind the simplicity of it, but found none that felt like an explanation she could easily label. The baby made a soft sound again, and Emily's attention shifted instantly, her body responding before her thoughts could catch up, and Daniel noticed that too. The way everything else in her world seemed to adjust around that small life, and he said quietly, almost to himself, She trusts you completely. And Emily glanced at him briefly, then back at her daughter. She has no reason not to, she said, and there was honesty in it, not sadness, just fact. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees now, his voice quieter when he spoke again. Most people wait for permission to care, he said. I stopped waiting. And Emily did not respond immediately, because for the first time since he arrived, she did not feel like she needed to push him away or let him in. She only felt the strange reality of someone sitting in her life without asking her to explain it, and that, more than anything else, was what unsettled her most. The afternoon light had begun to tilt lower through the small apartment window, stretching soft, golden lines across the worn wooden floor, and Emily stood near the crib again without fully realizing she had moved there, her hand resting lightly on the edge as her daughter slept more peacefully than she had in days, the quiet rhythm of breathing filling the space like something fragile and newly discovered. Behind her, Daniel remained at the table. But something had shifted in his posture, less observation now and more reflection, as if the silence itself had started to speak to him in ways he had not expected, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the kind of stillness that does not feel empty but full of unspoken thought. You are thinking too much, Emily said suddenly without turning around, her voice softer than before, almost faintly amused, and Daniel's gaze lifted toward her, a subtle change in expression suggesting he had been caught in something honest. I usually do, he replied, and there was a brief pause before he added. It is part of what I do. Though this time the words carried less authority and more admission, Emily turned slowly, leaning her shoulder against the crib as she looked at him more directly. That sounds exhausting, she said, not as sympathy but as observation, and Daniel gave a faint nod. It is, he answered simply, and the simplicity of it made the space between them feel less like distance and more like shared understanding. The baby shifted slightly, making a soft sound, and Emily immediately reached in, adjusting the blanket with practiced care, her movements calm but instinctive, and Daniel watched as he had been doing all day, noticing not just what she did but how naturally she did it, as if exhaustion had long ago been absorbed into habit. You keep saying you stopped waiting for permission, Emily said after a moment, her voice more thoughtful now, and she stepped away from the crib, slowly moving back toward the table. Permission for what exactly? And Daniel looked down briefly at his hands before answering. To act, he said. To step in when something is in front of me instead of waiting for it to become my responsibility on paper. And he paused, his tone quieter now. I used to think distance made things safer. And that sentence lingered in the air longer than anything else he had said. Emily sat down across from him again, not fully relaxed but no longer rigid, her eyes studying him with a different kind of attention now, less defensive and more curious. And now? She asked. You do not think that anymore. And Daniel shook his head slightly. Now I think distance just makes it easier to ignore things that matter. And there was no performance in his voice, no attempt to impress, only clarity. Outside, the light had shifted again, softer now, signaling the slow approach of evening, and the apartment felt quieter than it had in years, not because sound was missing, but because tension was. Emily folded her hands loosely on the table, her gaze drifting briefly toward the crib before returning to him. You are not what I expected, she said honestly, and Daniel responded without hesitation. Neither are you. And that small exchange carried more weight than either of them seemed to acknowledge. A faint vibration came again from Daniel's phone, but this time he did not even look at it, leaving it face down as before, and Emily noticed, her eyes lingering on the device for a moment before she spoke. You keep ignoring that. And Daniel nodded. It is not urgent, he said, and then after a pause added, not compared to this. And he did not gesture, did not explain, but the meaning was clear enough that Emily looked away briefly, uncertain how to respond to something that simple and direct. The baby gave a small sigh in her sleep, and Emily stood again instinctively, moving toward her. But this time Daniel also stood, not to interfere, just to see, and as she checked the crib, adjusting the blanket once more, she spoke without turning around. Most people would have left by now. and Daniel answered quietly from behind her. Most people would not have stayed in the first place. And that difference settled between them like something neither of them could easily dismiss. Emily finally turned slightly, her expression no longer guarded but still cautious. "And what happens after tonight?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a real question, and Daniel held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "We figure that out when it comes." And for the first time since he arrived, there was no certainty in his voice, only presence, and Emily realized that what unsettled her most was not that he had stayed, but that she no longer knew if she wanted him to leave. The evening settled more deeply now, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than daytime silence, and Emily found herself moving through small routines in the kitchen without fully thinking, rinsing the same cup again, wiping a counter that was already clean, as if repetition could keep her grounded while her mind kept circling the fact that Daniel was still there. Still sitting at her table as if he belonged in a space that had never known stability. The baby slept again in the crib, her breathing steady and calm, and that alone felt like an anchor holding the entire room together. But even that calm could not fully settle Emily's thoughts, because every few seconds she would glance toward Daniel as if expecting him to suddenly stand up and leave like everyone else eventually did. Daniel was no longer looking at his phone, it remained untouched on the table. And instead he was watching the small space with a kind of attention that felt different from earlier in the day, less analytical and more reflective, as if he was no longer evaluating but simply existing within it. "You are quieter now," Emily said after a while, breaking the silence without fully intending to, and Daniel looked up slightly. "So are you," he replied, and there was a faint hint of something almost like understanding in his voice, not playful, not distant, just observant. Emily leaned against the counter, folding her arms loosely. "I do not usually talk this much to strangers," she admitted, and the honesty in her own words surprised her for a moment, because it was true, she did not anymore, not after learning how quickly people left when things became inconvenient. Daniel nodded slightly. "I do not usually stay this long," he said, and there was no humor in it, just fact. And that fact created a strange balance between them, either fully comfortable, either fully distant. The baby stirred briefly, and Emily immediately pushed away from the counter, moving to check on her, adjusting the blanket. Again, her movements careful and familiar, and Daniel stood as well without being asked, simply observing the small interaction, not intruding, just present in the way he had been all day. "She sleeps like that because she feels safe," Emily said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Daniel answered softly. "She feels safe because you are here." And Emily paused at that, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the crib, because the words should have been simple, but they landed differently. Like something she had not allowed herself to hear before. A faint vibration sounded again from Daniel's phone, more insistent this time, and this time he finally glanced at it, his expression shifting slightly, not alarmed, but focused, and Emily noticed immediately. "Is that work?" she asked, and Daniel hesitated only briefly before replying. "It is always work," and then added after a short pause. "But I am not answering it." And that answer made her look at him more carefully, because it was not something she would have expected from someone like him. Emily moved back toward the table slowly, sitting down again, her eyes resting on his face as if trying to understand a pattern she could not yet see. "You keep choosing to stay here instead of wherever that is," she said, gesturing lightly toward the phone, and Daniel met her gaze steadily. "For tonight, yes," he said, and then after a brief pause added, "because tonight feels more real than anything else I am supposed to be doing." And the honesty in that statement shifted something subtle in the air between them. Emily did not respond immediately, because there was nothing easy to say to that, and instead she looked down at her hands again, noticing how tired they looked, how much they had done without complaint, and for the first time she wondered what it would feel like not to carry everything alone, even briefly. The apartment lights flickered softly, settling into a steady glow, and outside the window the city had fully transitioned into night, distant headlights moving like quiet reminders that life continued beyond this small space. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now. "You do not trust easily," he said, not as a question but as observation, and Emily gave a faint, almost invisible nod. Neither do you, she replied, and for the first time that night, something close to a faint understanding passed between them, not agreement, not certainty, but recognition. The baby shifted again, and Emily stood automatically, moving toward the crib, and Daniel followed at a respectful distance, not interfering, just observing the way she adjusted the blanket and placed her hand lightly on her daughter's chest to feel the steady rhythm of breathing, and in that moment, the silence between them no longer felt uncertain, it felt shared, as if either of them needed to fill it any more to prove they were still present. Emily did not say anything further, but as she looked at her sleeping daughter and then briefly back at Daniel standing quietly behind her, she realized that the question was no longer whether he would leave, but whether she was ready to let someone stay without knowing how long that stay would last. The night had fully settled now, not with the sharp edge of earlier hours but with a quieter depth that made the apartment feel smaller and more contained, and Emily stood by the crib. Longer than she intended, her hand resting lightly on the wooden rail as she watched her daughter sleep with a steadiness that still felt unfamiliar after so many restless nights, while behind her Daniel remained near the table, no longer checking his phone, no longer shifting his attention elsewhere, simply sitting in a stillness that matched the room in a way she did not know how to interpret. Emily finally turned away from the crib, moving slowly toward the small kitchen as if she needed motion to organize her thoughts, and when she spoke her voice was softer than before, almost uncertain. "You are still here," she said, not as a question, but as something she was still trying to accept, and Daniel looked up at her calmly. "Yes," he replied, as if it were the simplest answer in the world. Emily leaned against the counter, folding her arms loosely, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window where the city lights blurred in the distance. "I keep expecting you to leave," she admitted, and there was no accusation in her tone, only honesty, and Daniel nodded slightly. "I know," he said, then paused before adding, "most people would assume I already have." And that sentence lingered between them longer than expected, because it was not spoken with pride or distance, but with quiet understanding. Emily looked at him more directly now, studying him in a way she had not earlier, as if trying to reconcile the presence in her apartment with the kind of life she assumed he came from. "People like you do not usually stay in places like this," she said again, repeating something she had said before but now with less certainty, and Daniel responded without hesitation. "People like me usually leave before they are asked to." And there was a faint shift in his expression, something almost reflective. "That has been my pattern," he added. The baby stirred slightly in the crib, and Emily immediately moved toward her, adjusting the blanket with practiced care, her movements gentle and instinctive, and Daniel watched without interrupting, his attention steady but not intrusive, as if he had learned over the past hours that presence did not require interference. "She is calmer tonight," Daniel said quietly, and Emily nodded, her hand resting briefly on her daughter's chest to feel the steady rhythm of breathing. "She knows when the room feels safe," she replied, and for a moment neither of them spoke, letting the quiet fill the space again without needing to correct it or define it. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice lower, more measured. "You carry everything here alone," he said, not as pity but as observation, and Emily did not respond immediately. Because the truth of it did not require defense, only acknowledgement, and when she finally spoke it was soft, almost resigned. "I had to learn how," she said, then added after a pause, "There was no other choice." And Daniel's gaze lowered slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. A faint vibration came from his phone again, and this time Emily noticed the way his hand moved toward it before stopping, as if he had already decided not to engage with it, and she tilted her head slightly. "You are really not going to answer that?" she said, and Daniel shook his head once. "No," he replied. "Not tonight." And there was a calm certainty in his voice that made the words feel deliberate rather than impulsive. Emily studied him for a moment longer, then looked away toward the crib, her voice quieter now. "I do not understand why you are doing this," she said honestly, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady. "I am not doing anything extraordinary," he replied. "I and just staying in a room where someone needed help. And the simplicity of that answer made Emily pause, because it did not match the complexity she expected from someone like him. Outside, the city lights continued to move, distant and indifferent, but inside the apartment the atmosphere had shifted again, not into comfort exactly, but into something more stable, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And Emily found herself sitting down at the edge of the couch without realizing it, her shoulders finally lowering as the exhaustion of the day settled fully into her body. Daniel remained where he was, not closing the distance, not asking for permission, just existing in the same quiet space, and after a long moment Emily spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "People do not usually stay when things are uncertain." And Daniel answered without hesitation. "Then most people are not willing to see what happens after uncertainty." And that sentence lingered in the air as the baby slept peacefully, and the night outside continued without interruption, and for the first time Emily did not feel the need to decide what he was, only to acknowledge that he was still there. The night had grown deeper, settling into a calm that felt almost unreal compared to the chaos of earlier hours, and Emily stood once again by the crib, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the wooden rail as she watched her daughter sleep with a steady rhythm that now felt like the only constant in a world that rarely offered any, while behind her Daniel remained in the same place he had been for what felt like hours. Not moving closer, not stepping away, simply existing in a quiet stillness that no longer felt intrusive but instead strangely grounded. Emily finally turned, her movements slow, as if she was afraid that any sudden motion might break whatever fragile balance had formed in the room, and she leaned back against the small kitchen counter, her voice softer than before when she spoke. "It is getting late," she said, though it was not a suggestion for him to leave, more an acknowledgement of time passing, and Daniel looked toward her calmly. "Yes," he replied, and there was a brief pause before he added, "But I am not leaving yet." And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. Emily studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, no longer guarded in the way it had been at the beginning of the night, but still uncertain, as if she was standing at the edge of something she did not fully understand. "You keep saying that like it is normal," she said quietly, and Daniel gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "It should be," he replied, "but it is not for most people." And that honesty lingered between them, unpolished and direct. The baby stirred slightly, a soft sound breaking the silence, and Emily immediately moved toward the crib, adjusting the blanket with gentle precision, her hand resting briefly on her daughter's chest as if confirming the steady rhythm of sleep, and Daniel watched her without speaking, noticing the way her entire posture softened whenever she was near the child, as if everything else in her life temporarily faded into the background. "She trusts you completely," Daniel said quietly, and Emily let out a faint breath. "She does not have anyone else to compare it to," she replied, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only truth shaped by experience, and Daniel nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer without needing to challenge it. Emily returned to the couch, sitting down more slowly this time, her shoulders visibly lower than they had been earlier in the evening, and for a few moments neither of them spoke, allowing the quiet to settle again, not heavy, but present, like something they had both learned to exist within. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice steady but quieter than before. "You asked earlier why I stayed," he said, and Emily looked up at him, waiting. "It is not because I think I can fix anything," he continued. "It is because I think leaving would be easier than understanding what happens when I do not." And there was a brief pause before he added, "And I am tired of always choosing what is easier." And the words carried a weight that felt more personal than anything he had said so far. Emily did not respond immediately, because there was nothing simple to say to that, and instead she looked down at her hands resting loosely in her lap, noticing how still they finally were, how unfamiliar that stillness felt after so long. "People do not usually change what is easy," she said after a moment, not as a challenge but as observation, and Daniel nodded once. "I know," he replied. "That is why most people do not." And there was no arrogance in his voice, only quiet acknowledgement. Outside the window, the city continued its distant movement, lights shifting slowly through the night. But inside the apartment the atmosphere no longer felt unstable, it felt contained, like a moment suspended just long enough to be noticed. Emily leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the crib again, and then back to Daniel, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "So what happens tomorrow?" she asked, and Daniel did not answer immediately, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question without rushing it, and when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, steady, and unforced. "Tomorrow we deal with tomorrow," he said. "But tonight is still here." And Emily exhaled slowly at that, not in relief exactly, but in acceptance of something she was not yet ready to define. The baby shifted once more, then settled again, and Emily stood one last time to adjust the blanket, her movements gentle and unhurried, while Daniel remained where he was, no longer as a stranger occupying space, but as someone who had chosen not to leave when every expectation said he should have. And as the night continued quietly around them, Emily realized that the most unexpected part was not his presence, but the fact that she no longer felt the need to question it every second.